buckle up, because we are about to see the strategy behind every major movement currently happening in Ukraine, and some not-so-major movements too. While the West's attention was distracted by the surprising turn of events in Kursk, something equally, if not more important, has been happening in the opposite theater. Russia is on the move. It is slow, it is grindy, but it is accumulating over time. Meanwhile, back in the Kremlin, the progress raises complicated questions about just how far Russia will want to go along that front. As a result, today, I want to look at what exactly the Russian military has been up to over there, and put that in the general context of how a country decides where to stop an invasion. So, good news everyone. We are going to be seeing a lot of front lines on maps over the next 20 minutes. Now grab your aviators and let's get going. To situate ourselves, this is roughly what the line of control looked like at the beginning of the year. In the interim, there have been 6 interesting developments, or, in a couple of cases, non-developments. From north to south, these areas are the Luhansk front, what has happened east of Bakhmut, the Pokrovsk salient that receives the most attention right now, the quiet case of Vuhledar, Zaporizhia just to the east of it, and finally what is happening along the Dnipro River. We will explore each of those in depth in a moment. However, for this video, I'm going to limit the focus to just what is happening on the ground, plus what Russia's intent in these areas may be. Actually, this video started out as an explanation for why the front lines are moving in the manner that they are. But once I started drawing the lines on maps, I realized that the lines are worthy of a story in their own right. So, if you want to know the 10 explanations, I will see you next time. Or maybe in a couple of weeks, who knows. But with that caveat out of the way, let's zoom out and discuss where Russia intends to go with its invasion. And if you are exclusively here to see the lines, that is fine too. You can just skip ahead a few chapters. Again, I want to emphasize that we are talking about Moscow's thought process here, not Kyiv's, not Washington's, not anyone else's on God's green earth. Obviously, Ukraine in particular gets a veto here in practice, but it is better to focus on just one side of the political problem in a single video. Same goes for the United States with its indirect ability to influence decisions through aid, a power that the Biden administration appears to be exercising once again. One of the presidential candidates will also get a say depending upon who wins the November election, which I suppose makes Taylor Swift's opinion matter indirectly through mobilizing voters for one candidate. But those issues aside, in broad strokes, if you are sitting behind the decision-making desk in Moscow, there are 3 factors that you need to keep in mind. First is what is militarily possible. Yes, we have all seen the maps coming from Russia that appear to swallow all of Ukraine whole, or just leave a tiny landlocked fraction of the country remaining. Given the Kremlin's writings on the subject, a complete annexation may indeed be the optimal outcome in an ideal world from Russia's perspective. The thing is, though, in anyone's ideal world, we do not live. Indeed, Russia demonstrated an inability to secure Western Ukraine in the early months of 2022. And though the Kremlin has corrected many of its errors in the meantime, that general incapacity still remains today. So, yes, Russia is chipping away in the east, as we will see in a moment. However, the question for inside the halls of the Kremlin is not how far west to go, but rather where in the east to stop. That takes us to the second question: what is politically feasible? Any conversation on that topic has to go back to September 30th, 2022, and get familiar with this video because we are going to be seeing it a lot. That signature marked the official annexation of the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Oblasts into Russia by Russian law. This was the consequence of another quirk in Kremlin politics. Only 9 days earlier, Putin had taken a calculated political risk and announced the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers. One slight issue: conscripts are only intended to serve on Russian soil. Well, modern problems require modern solutions, and so the Kremlin declared those oblasts Russian. The long-run issue has become what happens if Russia does not control all of that territory by the end of the war. Does Putin worry that he will face domestic challenges if part of this sacred Russian territory is still administered by Ukraine? Or is the Kremlin insulated from the situation, just as it seems insulated with all sorts of other problems in the country? The answer determines how far Russia will want to run up against the limitations of its military capacity. The last of the three factors is the defensibility of the final line of control. To appreciate the importance of this consideration, look no further than that world-famous demilitarized zone that still lies between North and South Korea, almost 3/4 of a century past the end of that war. Like most conflicts, the physical fighting between Russia and Ukraine will not solve the underlying philosophical disagreement between the two countries. Rather, a hypothetical ceasefire will reflect a recognition that continued war is costly, and that neither side believes that further fighting will result in a better outcome than the frozen line. However, keeping that line stable may also require substantial military outlays, which are expensive in their own right. Not as bad as losing thousands of people a month, perhaps, but still a large line item in the budget each year. As a result, geographic features that naturally create defensible boundaries are helpful. Okay, that takes us to the 6 spots along the Eastern Front that are worth highlighting. We should begin with the Dnipro River front because it cleanly illustrates all 3 points. It turns out that this is one of the areas of non-movement. Indeed, little of note control-wise has happened there since Russia retreated from Kherson in November 2022. Now, what has changed is the geography. The land itself looks quite a bit different as a consequence of what is widely believed to be the Russian sabotage of the Kakhovka Dam in June 2023. To wit, here is what the area looked like before the dam's destruction. Note that throughout this section, it is Russian-held land south of the river, and Ukraine-held land north of it. But regardless, this again is the before, and this is what it looked like afterward. Pay no attention to the surrounding areas. The photo after was taken in the fall, while the photo before was taken in the winter. As a result, afterward looks livelier, whereas before looks drearier. Instead, note that the dam was here, and look at the reservoir behind it. Or, rather, look at the reservoir that was behind it. The comparison is even starker when you zoom out. It is just gone. Dam or no dam, though, the river remains wide enough that any major crossing would be a highly risky operation. That checks off both the military feasibility and the defensible boundary boxes as something that might be sustainable. Political feasibility is another story, however. The problem is that Kherson Oblast has the geographic quirk of Kherson City lying on the opposite side of the river, and thus Russian law recognizes this as Russia, despite blue and yellow flags all over the place there now. Actually, this was a major point of contention in Moscow back in the fall of 2022, with the Kremlin's political faction wanting to not withdraw for that very reason, and the military faction believing that it was a losing cause, with Commander of Forces Sergei Surovikin especially vocal. Well, his message was clear even if his face is not right now, but put a pin in that for later. Heading back to the big board, Zaporizhia is the next front worth mentioning. But once again, not much is happening there. Here is the extent of Russian control at the start of the year. Note that this is the empty reservoir, and the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is over here. Meanwhile, this is the extent of Russian control now. You would have to squint to see anything worth noting. It is basically this area here, which Ukraine gained during its 2023 summer counteroffensive, but has lost back to Russia in the time since. I swear there will be more action later in this video. Just give me a minute. Unlike Kherson, there is no natural geographic explanation here, as the river curves and leaves the eastern part open. And there is also a valuable target, Zaporizhia City, metro population 841,000, and also home of this stylish tourist board logo. Military feasibility runs into a problem here, though, as Ukraine would mount a substantial defense to try to protect not only the tourism board, but also the city itself. There would be a later period problem for Russia as well, in that Zaporizhia City's metro area extends west beyond the Dnipro. See, the Oblast lines get crazy. That is primarily why Russia's pressure here has mostly been bombings. Same story in Kherson, actually. The central political problem here, of course, goes back to this signature. Russia's domestic legal boundaries would still run in the way of a water barrier. Once again, we should put a pin in that, but just for a second this time. Okay, with the south done, let's travel north to Luhansk Oblast, site of the first noteworthy development. As we fly out there, note that this is the internationally recognized international border. And yes, I realize the silliness of that phrase, but I meant what I said. Anyway, Russia here, Ukraine there. Meanwhile, here we have the divider between the Luhansk and Kharkiv Oblasts. That would make this line an internationally recognized domestic border, or for those of you in Russia, a domestically recognized international border. God help us all. The creeping red area takes us to the line of control from the start of the year. This part is noteworthy in that Russia had already crossed into Kharkiv, even though, remember, that this is Russia-recognized Russia, and this is Russia-recognized not Russia. Isn't international politics fun? Anyway, this is where the front has moved to since then. The salient forming here is interesting. What is missing from this picture is how the Oskol River runs like this. Tactically, what Russia appears to be doing is to create a de facto pocket here, which will then force Ukraine to withdraw. It is basically what Ukraine aimed to do in Kursk, but that Russia has thus far repelled. I will avoid going into the details given that we just had an entire video on those maneuvers. Back in Luhansk, the plan would be to wash, rinse, and repeat down the line until Russia is flush up against the Oskol. Now, whether Russia has the military capacity to go beyond that is an open question. At the broad strategic level, Moscow might like the idea of using its northern incursion to pinch Kharkiv city here, and then get support from the east. Of course, each day that passes, that seems more and more like a stretch for Russia to pull off. This is what the front line looked like on July 1st, about 2 months into the offensive. And this is what it looks like now. The difference is basically just on the easternmost part. And even then, that is a bit misleading, because Russia was just filling in a section of contested space, rather than trying to contest new areas. Meanwhile, Ukraine was doing the same thing on the far west, effectively offsetting everything. In essence, the Russian incursion there took advantage of a lack of Ukrainian staffing and fortifications. But it lacked independent strength. Think of it as a Kursk offensive, but over a substantially smaller portion of territory. Meantime, if things ever did get worse, Ukraine would want to put even more effort into the defense of Kharkiv than of Zaporizhia, and so we are running up against the military feasibility part. Given that, the Oskol would be a sensible place to stop. Yes, it would require more investment in defensive positions because it is not nearly as wide as the Dnipro, but it does check that third box. And politically, it is fine. Remember, we are looking at a region that extends past the Luhansk border. Indeed, that actually might help make the problems with Kherson and Zaporizhia more politically feasible for Moscow. The pitch to domestic audiences would be that the large land bridge to Crimea is intact, and those deeper areas of Kherson and Zaporizhia were never really of vital interest to Russia anyway. Meanwhile, this extension in the north reflects the true historical borders of the Luhansk Oblast, and so it represents an acceptable swap. With that, we get to the meat of Russia's advances, the 3 separate areas within the Donetsk Oblast. Bakhmut is the most basic of these, so let's begin with a certain mercenary's favorite locale, Here is where things stood at the beginning of the year. At the time, the sensible targets were initially to the high ground of Chasiv Yar, which second would open up a window to the more populated city of Kramatorsk. Given how much blood was spent to reach Bakhmut back during the era of Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group, one might expect there to have been serious progress here. Instead, it has been a very slow crawl. If there is a success story for Ukraine along the Eastern Front this year, it is this. At least thinking about it relative to expectations, rather than in terms of absolute movement. The defense of Chasiv Yar has left Kramatorsk relatively protected, and thus kept Ukraine in Donetsk in more than just the strictest of senses. The second Donetsk hotspot is in Vuhledar, right along the point where the front line begins to turn to an east-west direction. Russia had twice tried major offensives on the town in 2022 and 2023, only to be repelled back at great cost, despite the town being small and seemingly inconsequential. But a pre-war population of 14,000, along with a large coal mine, was enough for them to keep going. Well, 2024 is another year. This is what the line of control looked like in January, and this is what it looks like now. Obviously, Russia is going for an encirclement here. With further progress made on the eastern side, a pivot westward would seal everything. However, imposing the road network onto your screen shows a more immediate problem. There are two main ways into the town, and Russia has sealed off both of them. There is also a dirt road that comes in from the north, but I am looking at my calendar right now, and I do not think that Ukraine wants to bet on mud. Thus, even without a full encirclement, Ukrainian troops face a dilemma of whether to fight with limited supplies. Or, alternatively, there is still a pathway to retreat, which would spare Russia the expense of a direct assault. That would indeed come at a high price. Most of the town is empty of civilians, as this 7-month-old official police photo shows. What is left is an endless stream of hollowed-out buildings, which serve as perfect hiding places for the soldiers who remain. But, then again, no Ukrainian soldier wants to be caught up in such a siege. This is the most likely place where something major will happen soon in the war, so keep an eye on it. The final Donetsk hotspot is the one that you likely have heard the most about, because it has been in the news for months now, much to the dismay of English speakers who keep having to try to say it. Pokrovsk. This one is worth giving a more expanded timeline on. Here's where things stood at the beginning of the year. The first major change was the capture of Avdiivka. Then a salient formed that broadly pointed toward Pokrovsk. The benefit of a successful push all the way out there would be to disrupt Ukraine's supply chain in the region, as Pokrovsk is a key logistics hub. However, rather than go straight there, Russia has more recently pivoted to try flattening out the salient. Rewinding, the concern before was that Ukraine could initiate a pincer counterattack from the north and south. The main effort for the short term now appears to be a gambit to envelop this part here, and it is indeed slowly closing, with Ukraine at risk of encirclement in yet another location. Nevertheless, Russia would eventually like to return to the Pokrovsk push. They still have about 10 kilometers to go before the city, though, and the city itself promises to be a meat grinder. As the seasons start to turn, it could become the winter of 2025's answer to the Battle of Bakhmut. Prigozhin may have come and gone, but in light of Ukraine's recent long-range drone strikes, some other entity may soon be asking where the artillery is to continue this assault. Zooming out, all told, Russia has captured about 60% of Donetsk, and thus 40% remains in Ukraine's hands. The oblast is 26,517 square kilometers, leaving about 10,607 square kilometers left. During August, Russia picked up 351 square kilometers of Ukraine, almost all in Donetsk. Compare that to the 10,607 square kilometers, and that is still 2.5 years of work left to do, with the caveat that this pace is subject to change. Now, the Russian army appears to retain the capacity to keep marching forward despite the costs. There is no obvious defensive barrier that might influence an earlier stoppage, something like a river, and the Kremlin's political narrative regarding the Donbass further encourages the fighting to continue. 2.5 more years of this would not be easy, but it certainly is plausible. All of that suggests that there will be enough political will to continue the process, absent some major change in the Kremlin's internal dynamics. Meanwhile, as for changes in the dynamics of these outros, nope, we are still looking at 2 awesome books about the war, both written by your favorite political will. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.